Friends, thank you for being here today. Something extraordinary is happening in Washington right now, a shift so subtle in its mechanics yet so seismic in its implications that it risks being lost amidst the daily cacophony of breaking news headlines. It is a phenomenon that defies the conventional gravity of modern American politics, where partisanship usually dictates every maneuver and loyalty is the currency of survival. What we are witnessing is not coming from the opposition party. It is not a barrage of attacks from the media, nor is it the clamor of protesters gathering outside the White House gates. For the first time in this administration, the most significant pushback against Donald Trump is coming from inside the walls. Republicans themselves, quietly, deliberately, and with a growing sense of urgency, are moving to block the power the president is attempting to hold on to at any cost. We are watching a collision between emergency declarations, war-level rhetoric, and behind-the-scenes legislative panic. As Congress steps in to draw a line in the sand, we must understand that this is not merely another political skirmish. It is not just fodder for the Sunday talk shows. It is a fundamental stress test of the American experiment. It asks a question that the Founding Fathers wrestled with in the Federalist Papers, and that every generation must answer for itself. Is American power ruled by the steady hand of the law or by the volatile instincts of one man? To understand the magnitude of this moment, we must look past the surface-level drama. We must look at the machinery of governance itself. What is unfolding here could reshape how power works in the United States long after the current headlines fade into history. Before we analyze the mechanics, I'd like to know your initial take. Do you see this Republican pushback as a momentary fracture or the start of a permanent shift in party dynamics? Let me know your thoughts in the comments as we dig deeper. To see this dynamic in action, we must first examine the internal fracture that is widening within the party itself. Imagine the scene late at night in Washington. The marble hallways of Capitol Hill are quiet, but the digital infrastructure is alive. Phones are lighting up. Aides are whispering in corridors. Senators are checking their screens twice to confirm the reality of what they are reading. The President of the United States is furious, but his fury is directed not at the Democrats who oppose him ideologically, nor at the press he derides as the enemy of the people. His fury is directed at his own party. For the first time in a long time, the rebellion is internal. And in the history of political power, that is where the real danger always begins. When the call comes from inside the House, the structural integrity of the presidency itself is at stake. Right now, Republicans are revolting against Donald Trump. It is crucial to distinguish this from the usual background noise of Washington. This is not the standard MAGA infighting or the anonymous leaks from disgruntled staffers meant to scare donors or settle petty scores. This is something deeper, colder, and far more consequential. It cuts directly into the one thing President Trump believes he cannot live without: unchecked, unilateral power. Why does this revolt matter now? Why have the guardrails, which seemed dormant for so long, suddenly activated? It is not merely because some supporters feel betrayed over broken promises. It is true that there is discontent over the vow of no new wars, the soaring cost of living, or the lingering, unanswered questions surrounding long-promised disclosures that never seem to arrive. But political disappointment is standard fare. What is happening now is structural. Republican lawmakers themselves are beginning to openly move against the very authority Trump is desperate to cling to. When the internal antibodies of the system start to attack the executive, presidents do not typically respond with calm introspection. They escalate, they dramatize, they declare emergencies. That is the pattern we are watching unfold. We are seeing a presidency leaning hard into the language of spectacle and crisis to protect itself from internal collapse. But to truly understand why this is happening now, we need to examine the catalyst, a stark geopolitical reality check. At the heart of this entire revolt is a simple but terrifying reality that even seasoned Washington veterans are struggling to process out loud. The friction point, the spark that lit this specific fire, was the realization that the President of the United States has been publicly entertaining the idea of using military force in ways that could drag America into conflict, not with a distant adversary or a rogue state, but with its own allies. When Senator Chris Murphy laid this out in blunt terms, it landed like a shockwave through the Senate chamber. Once you strip away the bluster, the campaign-style rhetoric, and the branding exercises, what you are left with is a scenario that sounds absurd until you remember that we have stopped being allowed to dismiss these statements as mere jokes. Consider the rhetoric surrounding Greenland. To the casual observer, it sounded like a bizarre real estate fantasy, a desire to purchase a massive island. But Greenland is not a blank space on a map waiting for a developer. It is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. Denmark is a NATO ally. This is where the conversation shifts from the absurd to the dangerous. NATO's core principle is Article 5, collective defense. An attack on one is an attack on all. This means that any military action or coercive force used against that territory is not just symbolic. It is a legal and strategic nightmare. Theoretically, it places the United States in direct conflict with Europe. It upends the post-World War II order in a single news cycle. The fact that lawmakers are now having to seriously explain this to the public, to clarify that we cannot simply take territory from an ally, is itself a sign of how unmoored the conversation has become. No one in America voted for a presidency that risks a shooting war with allies over land acquisition rhetoric. And yet, here we are, parsing comments, weighing hypotheticals, and watching members of Trump's own party quietly but firmly try to shut the door before it is kicked open. This specific incident highlights the fundamental disconnect between the president's worldview and the responsibilities of his office. Trump does not process geopolitics through the lens of alliances, treaties, or shared security obligations. He processes it like property, like leverage, like a business deal that can be forced if you push hard enough. In a boardroom, that mindset might result in a hostile takeover. In global politics, it gets people killed. This brings up a difficult question for us to consider. When a president treats a military alliance like a real estate transaction, does it strengthen American leverage or fundamentally weaken our security? I'm curious to read your analysis on this specific point. Republican senators know this. They understand that words from the Oval Office have kinetic power. Once a president frames military action as an option, the vast machinery of the American military-industrial complex starts moving. Whether Congress likes it or not, contingency plans are drawn, assets are repositioned, signals are sent. This is why the War Powers Act suddenly became the battlefield. It was no longer an abstract constitutional debate about the separation of powers. It became an emergency brake. When that brake was pulled, when Republicans joined Democrats to advance a resolution limiting the president's ability to act unilaterally, Trump did not respond with negotiation. He did not invite leadership to the White House for a strategy session. He responded with rage, profanity, and threats. The reported phone call to Senator Susan Collins wasn't just about whipping votes. It was about the shock of discovering that loyalty has limits. It was the realization that even in his own party, there are lines that cannot be crossed without resistance. For Trump, that resistance feels existential because his entire second-term strategy hinges on projecting strength, inevitability, and total control. Nothing undermines that projection faster than members of your own party publicly telling you no, especially when the issue at stake is war, authority, and constitutional boundaries. This brings us to the inevitable escalation, where emergency powers are transformed into political weapons. Faced with this pushback, the president does not retreat. He reframes. He reaches for the ultimate tool in the executive toolkit, the language of emergency. He declares extraordinary measures not just as policy tools, but as political weapons. The declaration of a national emergency, specifically the recent moves tied to Venezuelan oil assets, fits perfectly into this pattern. It allows him to cast himself as the sole protector of national security. It allows him to portray dissenting lawmakers not as principled constitutionalists, but as obstacles to American safety. However, the underlying reality of the Venezuelan situation is far more complicated than the emergency declaration suggests. It involves long timelines, massive corporate interests, uncertain infrastructure, and benefits that would flow primarily to multinational energy companies rather than ordinary Americans. It is an economic and logistical quagmire, not an imminent security threat requiring the suspension of normal legislative procedure. But complexity has never been the point. The point is dominance. The point is distraction. The point is control of the narrative. We must understand the utility of emergencies in this context. Emergencies change the rules. Emergencies centralize authority in the executive branch. Most importantly, emergencies shift attention away from uncomfortable questions. There are few questions more uncomfortable for this administration right now than why long-promised transparency efforts have stalled. Why have document releases been delayed? Why has it taken bipartisan pressure rather than executive initiative to move certain oversight actions forward? This is a pivotal moment for the definition of executive power. Do you believe the emergency label is being used appropriately here, or is this an overreach that sets a trap for future administrations? Share your perspective below. When lawmakers like Senator Sheldon Whitehouse start talking openly about Inspector General compliance failures and unanswered timelines, it signals something critically important. They are not issuing a conclusion or a criminal accusation. They are expressing a concern that the process itself has broken down. That concern is exactly what Trump cannot afford. His political survival depends not just on winning arguments, but on exhausting the public. The strategy is to flood the zone, to keep every controversy competing for oxygen so that the public becomes numb to the details. If everything is a crisis, nothing is a crisis. If everything is breaking news, nothing is accountability. These threads, the Republican Revolt, the War Powers Resolution, the emergency declarations, and the stalled disclosures are not separate stories. They are the same story viewed from different angles. It is the story of a presidency trying to outrun accountability by accelerating chaos. Yet beyond the public chaos, there is a shadow war unfolding over oversight and the bureaucracy. While the public argument rages over war powers and emergency declarations, a quieter, more unsettling pressure is building beneath the surface. This is the shadow war of oversight. Every time the administration escalates the language of crisis, it inadvertently shines a light on what it seems most eager to outrun: oversight, documentation, timelines, and the slow, methodical work of accountability. This is where the story takes a darker, more procedural turn. It moves away from the theatrics of rallies and tweets and into the uncomfortable territory of process failures. When lawmakers begin asking why promised disclosures are delayed, why reviews stretch on indefinitely, and why statutory deadlines slip without explanation, they are identifying red flags. Red flags are dangerous not because they prove wrongdoing in the moment, but because they invite scrutiny. Scrutiny is the one thing a presidency built on speed, spectacle, and dominance struggles to manage. The discussion around delayed document releases has become sensitive precisely because the administration itself elevated these disclosures into a defining promise. They signaled urgency, they signaled prioritization, they signaled transparency. When the reality unfolds far more slowly than the rhetoric suggested, it creates a credibility gap. When senators begin publicly describing the gap between expectation and execution, emphasizing numbers, timelines, and compliance requirements rather than conspiracy theories, it reframes the issue entirely. It turns it from a political talking point into an administrative credibility test. Credibility is the currency of governance. Once it is questioned, every subsequent explanation faces higher skepticism. The request for Inspector General reviews is not an accusation. It is an admission that something in the process went wrong. Whether it was mismanagement, delay, or conflicting priorities, the system failed to deliver. For an administration already battling internal revolt, this kind of inquiry compounds the pressure. Inspectors General operate outside political theater. They deal in memos, records, and chains of decision-making. Their work does not disappear with a tweet. Their findings cannot be mocked away at a rally. They represent the deep state in the truest sense, the permanent bureaucracy that functions on rules rather than loyalty. This explains the president's strategy of escalation. Whenever scrutiny tightens, the narrative widens. Emergencies are declared, External threats are emphasized. The conversation shifts from documentation to dominance, from compliance to confrontation. It is a reflex honed over decades. Change the subject, raise the stakes, and hope the audience moves on. But Congress is not an audience. It is a co-equal branch of government. Some lawmakers are beginning to behave like it again. They are pressing for subpoenas. They are following financial trails. They are asking why certain avenues were not pursued proactively if transparency was truly the priority. This is not about proving a specific outcome. It is about explaining a process. Processes do not have feelings. They have records, and records are stubborn things. The deeper this inquiry goes, the more it threatens to collide with Trump's preferred mode of operation, which is personal control over the narrative rather than institutional disclosure. That collision is what he fears because it limits his ability to redefine reality on demand. This dynamic forces a complex calculation within the GOP, a choice between perceived betrayal and necessary preservation. This brings us back to the core of the issue. Why are Republicans themselves so uneasy? Why now? They see the convergence forming. War powers are being challenged. Emergency powers are being scrutinized. Disclosure processes are being questioned. Internal party unity is fraying. They understand that this is not just a bad news cycle. It is a systems test. It is a test that asks whether institutions still function when pressure comes from the top rather than the outside. Some Republicans are now quietly acknowledging that the real risk isn't what investigators might find in the documents. The real risk is what happens if oversight fails entirely. A system that cannot examine itself becomes brittle, and brittle systems do not bend, they shatter. This awareness has shifted the internal conversation inside the GOP from defense to distance, from justification to insulation. Lawmakers are calculating how to separate their own constitutional responsibilities from a presidency that increasingly treats those responsibilities as obstacles. We are witnessing a shift from loyalty to triage. Republicans are no longer asking how to help Trump win the next news cycle. They are asking how to prevent irreversible damage to the institutions they still need to function after he is gone. This is a conservative instinct in the truest sense, the preservation of the order. They understand that today's shortcuts become tomorrow's precedents. If they allow a Republican president to normalize unilateral military threats or the casual use of emergency powers to bypass Congress, they are handing that same weapon to a future Democratic president. I want to pause on this idea of precedent. Do you agree with the Republican calculation here? That expanding power for your own party today inevitably endangers your party tomorrow. Or is immediate political victory worth the institutional risk? Let me know what you think. If these norms collapse now, they will not magically reappear later. This anxiety has turned routine votes into flashpoints. It has turned phone calls into confrontations. It has turned policy disagreements into existential tests of institutional survival. This revolt feels different because it is driven not by ideology, but by alarm. It is driven by lawmakers who understand that when emergency powers become routine and war rhetoric becomes casual, the line between governance and authoritarianism blurs. Once that line disappears, it rarely comes back without a cost. That cost is what Republicans are now trying, perhaps belatedly, to avoid. Even as Trump escalates attacks and frames every check on his power as an attack on the nation itself, they are realizing that silence is no longer neutral. Inaction becomes a form of consent. Furthermore, we must confront the intangible yet devastating cost of this strategy, the normalization of crisis as a method of governance. There is a concept in engineering called the normalization of deviance, where safety standards are gradually eroded because nothing terrible happens immediately after a violation. Over time, the unacceptable becomes the standard. We are witnessing this dynamic in the constitutional architecture of the United States. When the War Powers Act is treated as a suggestion rather than a law, and when emergency declarations are used to bypass the power of the purse for economic objectives, like the leveraging of Venezuelan oil assets, we are not just seeing a policy dispute. We are seeing the redefinition of emergency itself. If an administration can classify a complex, long-term economic restructuring as an imminent national security threat requiring unilateral action, then the definition of emergency becomes boundless. It becomes a blank check signed by the executive and drawn on the account of legislative authority. This creates a boy who cried wolf scenario on a geopolitical scale. When every political objective is framed as an existential crisis to justify extraordinary powers, what language is left when a true, immediate catastrophe strikes? The public, exhausted by the perpetual alarm, may lose the capacity to distinguish between political theater and genuine peril. This exhaustion is strategic. It breeds a form of civic cynicism that is fatal to democratic accountability. When voters are bombarded with the message that the system is rigged, the deep state is in control, and only the leader can fix it, they do not necessarily become revolutionaries. They become spectators. They tune out. And in a democracy, apathy is the most fertile ground for authoritarianism. The Republican senators pushing back are not just fighting for their own relevance. They are fighting against the calcification of this cynicism. They are attempting to demonstrate that the system can still work, that checks and balances are not merely dusty theories from the 18th century, but living, breathing mechanisms that can still say no. Moreover, this internal instability projects a dangerous signal to the world. We must not forget that the global audience is watching this stress test with intense interest. Allies in NATO, already rattled by the Greenland rhetoric, are looking at the war powers conflict and asking a fundamental question. Can the United States be trusted to keep its word if the president views treaties as transactional leverage? Meanwhile, adversaries in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran see opportunity in the chaos. A superpower distracted by its own immune system attacking itself is a superpower that is less attentive to the shifting tectonic plates of global influence. When a president openly fights his own party over the legality of military action, it signals a fracture in resolve that emboldens bad actors to test boundaries they might otherwise respect. This is why the stakes of the current Republican revolt transcend the immediate legislative outcomes. It is about preventing the precedent of a hybrid presidency, one that operates with the trappings of democracy but the unchecked impulses of autocracy. If the GOP, the party of the president, fails to hold the line on these procedural norms, they validate the idea that the executive is above the law as long as the economy holds or the base remains loyal. That is a Rubicon that, once crossed, changes the geography of American freedom permanently. And this leads us to the conclusion of our analysis, which reveals the final stress test facing the Republic. And so, this is where the story ultimately lands. It does not land on a single vote, or a single phone call, or even a single emergency declaration. It lands on a reckoning that Republicans, Democrats, and the public alike can no longer postpone. What we are watching is not just a clash of personalities or a cycle of outrage. It is a stress test of whether American governance still functions when pressure comes from inside the highest office rather than from outside threats. The reason this moment feels different, heavier, more consequential, is that the resistance is no longer purely partisan. It is institutional. It is procedural. It is driven by lawmakers who may disagree on tax rates or healthcare, but who increasingly agree on one uncomfortable truth. Power justified only by personal will, insulated by emergency language, and defended through intimidation, eventually turns against the very system that grants it legitimacy. Republicans know this, even if they won't all say it out loud. They understand that the rules must hold. Trump, for all his bravado, senses this shift. That is why his rhetoric has grown sharper, his framing more apocalyptic, and his reliance on emergency powers more pronounced. Leaders who feel control slipping do not slow down. They accelerate. They raise the stakes. They demand loyalty tests. They insist that only they can protect the nation from collapse, even as their own actions create the instability they warn against. That paradox is at the center of this presidency's current act. A leader obsessed with legacy is increasingly boxed in by process. A party is torn between short-term alignment and long-term survival. Institutions are forced to choose whether they will be performative or functional when it matters most. For the audience watching this unfold, the temptation is to treat it as just another chapter in a long-running political drama. But that would be a mistake. That would miss the point entirely. The real question isn't whether Trump wins the next argument or dominates the next news cycle. The real question is whether the rules that govern power are still stronger than the people who temporarily hold it. That question doesn't belong to politicians alone. It belongs to voters. It belongs to citizens. It belongs to anyone who expects stability rather than spectacle from leadership. As this revolt continues, as oversight grinds forward, and as emergency narratives collide with constitutional limits, the outcome will tell us something profound about where American democracy actually stands. Not in theory, but in practice. Systems don't fail all at once. They erode gradually, challenged, tested, and normalized until someone finally says no. Right now, that no is coming not from the outside, but from within. From Republicans who understand that stopping a leader from going too far is not betrayal. It is responsibility. Whether that responsibility holds under pressure will shape not just this presidency, but the rules every future president inherits. That is why this moment matters so much. It deserves attention beyond outrage. It demands engagement, scrutiny, and conversation, because democracy doesn't protect itself. It relies on people willing to defend it when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, and politically risky. That defense, quiet or loud, is the real story unfolding behind the headlines. It is a story that will be written not by declarations or threats, but by the choices made when power meets its limits. And the world is watching to see whether those limits still mean anything at all. Friends, I'm leaving this conversation here, but I want to continue it in the comments. Is this the moment the system breaks, or the moment it proves its resilience? I'll be reading your thoughts. Thank you for watching.